Welcome back. In our last two lectures, we discussed the process of conducting and using research. Whether you're writing a magazine article or a short story, an essay for class, or a presentation for work, there are very few types of writing that wouldn't benefit from a little research. So in Lecture 18, we discussed how to go about acquiring information, and in Lecture 19, we discussed how to use that information once you've found it, paying particular attention to things like issues of concern that pop up like proper attribution and avoiding plagiarism. But sometimes the hardest part of producing a polished piece of writing is in fact simply the act of getting started. The blank screen on the computer or the blank sheet of paper in front of you can seem particularly daunting if you have several ideas and you're unsure where to start, or even worse, if you know you need to compose something and you feel as if you have no ideas, let alone how to begin organizing them into a persuasive piece of text. This lecture will help introduce some techniques that can make starting a piece of writing seem a little less formidable than might at first seem to be the case. Today we'll talk about how to get your pen moving or your fingers clicking across the keyboard. I found that once I get started, as long as I have a clear idea in my head about what I want to say and how I want to say it, the writing process is easier and it even becomes fun once I get past the initial hurdle and I'm a couple of paragraphs in. But that's me. You might be totally different. You might be the kind of person who gets going but runs out of steam partway through. So the first thing to do, and arguably the most important thing, is to try and get a sense of what kind of person and what kind of writer you are. Take a moment. Try to think about how you might describe yourself. Do you prefer organization? Do you have a label maker that you use regularly? Do you work better with materials strewn around so that they're within easy reach? Or do you like things put neatly away so you can find them again? As I've said repeatedly, and as you're probably getting really tired of hearing me say, no matter what kind of writer you are, it's important that you give yourself time whenever you're starting a new writing project. That means whenever possible, don't begin something the night before it needs to be handed in or mailed off. To produce a really polished piece of writing, you might give yourself 3 days. Set aside 1 day for brainstorming or pre-writing, 1 for drafting the letter or the short essay or whatever other document it is that you need to produce, and then 1 day for revising. If you don't have 3 days, and despite the best of intentions, all of us at one point or another find ourselves trying to write something the night before the deadline. In that case, if you don't have 3 days, try to at least give yourself 3 breaks. Maybe take a short break after brainstorming. Then give yourself an hour off after writing the first draft. And then give yourself at least another hour, if not a whole night, between the initial composition and the revision process. We'll talk more about revision in a later lecture, but I can't stress enough how important it is to try to look at your writing with fresh eyes at some point in the process. And that means even if you just set the first draft aside, go out for a walk, and then pick it up again, that little time away from it can help you to see your writing in a more objective and critical light. It helps to give you enough distance from it so that you can make it the best it can be. Let's take an example from earlier in the course. Let's say you've been given an assignment to write an argumentative essay about the short story, The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and we discussed that in a few lectures earlier in this course. We focused particularly on it in Lecture 5, where we talked about fiction, finding your voice, and having respect for your audience. And as you may remember, this story is told in the first person. It's as if we're reading the main character's diary, and what the diary chronicles is her descent into insanity. It's a decline that seems to be triggered and sped up in part by this hideous yellow wallpaper in the narrator's bedroom. So let's say the assignment is wide open. You have to write on the yellow wallpaper, but you have no idea where to begin. First, you'll need to do some brainstorming, and you have to try and find out what really intrigues you about this text. Again, you need to find a hook or a way in. So take a moment, and given what you know about the yellow wallpaper, you might make a quick list, and it might look something like this. These are just some ideas I jotted down quickly. You might write on a piece of paper: 1. Narrative style interesting. Story is told in the first person by an unreliable narrator. 2. Clues at certain moments contribute to major impact at the end. Narrator grows more and more obsessed with yellow wallpaper. 3. Increasingly ominous tone. Narrator at first describes room as a former nursery, but details make it sound more like some type of prison. Bed is bolted to the floor, bars on the windows, rings attached to the walls. 4. Problematic conclusion. We shift from reading her words on the page to reading her thoughts. Problem with consistency. 5. Issue of gender. Much of the plot seems to hinge on the fact that doctor has prescribed strict rest for narrator, but the treatment, specifically geared toward a woman, seems to be making things worse rather than better. Okay, so there you have a list of 5 interesting things. Some of these overlap, and now you have to find a way to craft an argument based on the list of things you found compelling or interesting about the text. So what interests you the most? Well, it might be the unreliable narrator and the way that Charlotte Perkins Gilman makes a mistake, asking us essentially to ignore the fact that she moves near the end from giving us the narrator's written thoughts to giving us her actual thoughts. But it might be that although this is a story about insanity, it's really a story about gender and the different ways that gender can cause doctors to treat their patients. Just a little bit of research into Charlotte Perkins Gilman's life reveals that this does indeed seem to be one of the things that interested her and encouraged her or inspired her to write this story. Any biographical information on Charlotte Perkins Gilman contains the fact that after suffering from postpartum depression, her doctor ordered her to undergo a rest cure, which is very much like the one described in this story. She was forbidden to write or to really take care of her child, and it's a situation that she later said drove her right to the brink of insanity. She stated on numerous occasions that the only way she pulled herself out of this state was to do the opposite of what her doctor had ordered. Most importantly, she started writing again. This experience convinced her that medicine at the time, with its emphasis on the idea that women had delicate constitutions, actually contributed to making them subservient to men, contributed to preserving the status quo of gender inequality at the time. So after doing this little bit of research, you may have some idea that this is a topic to which you can do some justice. Your main focus is manageable, it's a single short story, but there looks to be a fair amount in the way of secondary sources that you could use to help you with your research. So to guide you as you start writing, you might choose something like this as your main idea or thesis. Quote, although on the surface, Charlotte Perkins Gilman's short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, is about one woman's decline into insanity, closer analysis reveals that it is really a critique of gender relations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Okay, so what next? Well, your next step would be to find some key pieces of evidence supporting your point. And here you want to make use both of what we call primary and secondary sources. And I've mentioned these terms before. The primary source is the original piece of writing, the short story itself. And the secondary sources would be books and or articles about Charlotte Perkins Gilman and about this particular short story. So first, you might reread the story carefully, noting any instances of what seem to be references to the matter of gender. You might highlight the passage where the narrator mentions that she and her husband have retreated to the country to help her, quote, get well, or the moment where she says there's a nurse who's responsible for caring for her young child, and that the journal she's keeping is written on the sly. More than once, the narrator makes references to the fact that she needs to keep her writing hidden, as she's not supposed to be writing a word. So with this as your base, you might turn to any secondary sources you've found. Here you might copy onto your note cards or into your note file what other critics have said on this topic, especially how they analyze certain scenes in the story. And you might certainly look at biographical data, evidence of relevant events in the author's life, and indeed her own comments on the story itself. She made several. And so from here, you have a decent argumentative framework that you can fill in with your own argument about the topic. This same process can work in a variety of other situations, like if you're writing a letter applying for a job. First, you might do some free writing or brainstorming. For example, you might make a list of the specific qualifications that the job requires, and then you might make another list of your own qualifications. A list like this can help you figure out how to organize your letter. Maybe you're currently a gardener, but you want to apply for a job as an editorial assistant. Should you mention your current job as a gardener first? Or maybe should you mention before that the fact that you were an English major in college and that you wrote for your college's newspaper? Obviously, while you certainly should discuss your current job and there's no reason to hide it, you don't want that to be the first thing you mention in a letter like this, because you're not applying for a job as a gardener. And as with the yellow wallpaper example, you might want to do a little research about the company to which you're applying. Maybe you'll discover that you and the CEO are from the same small town in the Midwest, or that you went to the same college. As long as you can manage it without seeming awkward or forced, it might be helpful to include these details in your letter. So instead of writing, "When I was in college, I wrote for my school's newspaper," you might write, "During my junior year at St. Excellence College, I was a reporter for the St. Excellence Daily, the campus paper." Now, right about now, you may be saying, "Okay, that's all well and good, but I am feeling blocked about even beginning the brainstorming stage." So I'll give you a few strategies that have worked for me and for friends and colleagues of mine. And in doing this, I'm probably going to reveal far too much about what will appear to be my own neuroses, but I hope you won't mind indulging me just for a moment or so. So one thing that works against all of us as we attempt to get started with the process of writing is the desire to produce a really good piece of prose. On the surface, this might seem totally contradictory. Wanting to do something well actually makes it harder to do it. But when confronted with a challenge that seems particularly daunting, the desire to do well can make it seem totally impossible. And sometimes, in order to get to the good writing, you have to slog through some garbage. In other words, one way to get to a point where you produce something decent, something good, is to give yourself permission to write poorly. Now, giving yourself this permission can really be liberating. It allows you to scribble or type ideas or points in no particular order, with poor grammar, bad spelling, incomplete sentences. The key here is to simply get whatever ideas you have out of your head and onto the paper. One thing that can help you get started with this deliberately bad writing is to set a time limit on yourself. Let's say you have the whole day to write an essay or letter. Now, in some ways, this can actually hinder you from getting started because you think, well, I have all day. I'll empty the dishwasher first, or I'll do the laundry. And then pretty soon you're organizing all your closets, you've cleaned out the refrigerator, you've alphabetized and arranged all your books according to the Dewey Decimal System, and you're using a label maker. And you're labeling things like timer or microwave, things that don't need labels. Okay, so this is where leaving yourself enough time ahead of due dates can work in your best interest. If you start 3 days before something is due, on the first day, it might help you if you actually set a limit and say, for example, today, I am only allowed to write for 1 hour and then I have to stop. Setting these kinds of boundaries can actually motivate you to start. The task has a definite ending time, so it might be nice to get it out of the way. Then you sit down at your desk or at the computer, and you can write on the topic in any way you like. You would be amazed at how productive you can be if you've told yourself, I only have an hour, or I get to stop as soon as I've done my hour. Okay, so now you may think this next part is a little nuts, but I took this approach to extreme lengths when I was working on my PhD dissertation. What helped me initially was that I had a really supportive, understanding professor as my major professor and director of my dissertation. I'd finished my coursework, I had passed my written and my oral exams, and then I was supposed to start writing my dissertation. And I was utterly paralyzed. I took up knitting, which conveniently took up some time when I should have been researching or writing, and my apartment was spotless. After about a month of this, my dissertation director called me, and he said that I needed to bring him 8 to 10 pages of something the following Friday. This something, he said on my answering machine, would most likely be terrible. And he actually said this. I should have saved the message. It's a great message. But anyway, this is probably going to be awful, and that's fine. We have to start somewhere, and probably somewhere in the terribleness of the 8 to 10 pages I brought him, we'd find a good idea that we could start working with. So I showed up at his office at 9 a.m. on Friday, and I handed him my 8.5 pages of what I was sure was the worst garbage ever written on the legend of King Arthur in the Middle Ages. And it was pretty bad. Maybe not the worst, but it came close. But my director was right, and giving myself permission to write poorly quickly became liberating as I figured out a way to keep my momentum up. So after we talked about it, my professor was able to help me pick out what was useful or interesting in that chunk of bad writing, and then I could keep going. The strategy that I then used was to tell myself that I needed to write a certain number of hours per day, at least 5 days a week. And I tried to figure that in a typical 8-hour workday, maybe about 4 of those are actual serious work. So I decided to start small, and I set myself what seemed at first to be this really manageable, paltry goal of just 20 hours a week. But those were 20 real hours. So when I sat down at my desk every day, and here's where the crazy comes in, when I sat down at my desk, I noted the time on a small note card. I then read, I wrote, I reread, I edited, until there was some sort of interruption. Let's say the phone rang, or I wanted to get myself something to drink. When that interruption happened, I immediately noted the time on the note card, and then I added up the minutes that I had worked so far. So if I started working at 8 a.m. and the phone rang at 8:06, I had done 6 minutes out of the 240 that were my goal for that day. What I discovered pretty quickly is that this approach made me want to start sooner, because I told myself that once I had done my 240 minutes, I was free to do whatever else I wanted, or whatever else I needed. I could prepare for the classes I was teaching that semester, I could go to the gym, I could knit for a while, whatever. And pretty soon, it became a game. More often than not, when I reached the 4-hour mark, I was in the middle of an interesting idea, or I was writing down what I thought was a particularly good insight, and I didn't want to stop. So what did I do with those extra minutes that I was working? Well, I told myself, if I work some more minutes now, I can work fewer tomorrow. And then I began thinking, what if I do 8 solid hours of dissertation work today? Why, I could take all of tomorrow off. And then on weekends, even though I technically had given myself permission not to do any work, I figured I could get a little work done, and then I could count that time toward the next week's total. You can see what's happening here. Pretty soon I was in this steady rhythm, and I was playing mind games with myself and imagining that I could get so much work done that I could take a whole month off. And then the next thing I knew, the dissertation was done. I still find this approach useful today when I have a chunk of substantial writing and research to do. If I'm working on an article or a book chapter, I set myself a goal of a certain number of minutes per day or hours per week, and I try to meet that. And even if I don't quite make it, it's still an excellent motivator that helps me to be more productive. My husband says he always knows whenever I'm working on a writing project because he finds little slips of paper all over the house that have times and numbers of minutes written on them. Now, Part of what makes this approach particularly useful is something I like to call the scattershot approach. In other words, you throw all your ideas out of your head and onto the page with little or no concern for order, spelling, grammar, all that important stuff, and you leave the unholy mess there, and then you return to it after some time away. After a break, and remember, we've talked at considerable length about how important it is to take a break and come back to your writing with what I like to call fresh eyes. After some time away, you can come back and take a look at what you've written, and then you can start to think about how the pieces that you've put on the page could be rearranged into something that you hope resembles a coherent argument. Another thing to realize is that very often the process of writing itself can help you figure out what it is you're trying to say. I cannot tell you how often I see students who hand in a paper that begins a little wobbly, but by the end, they've expressed some wonderfully original insight that they didn't have when they started. This phenomenon is called writing your way to an argument. And while this is wonderful, what would be ideal is if this happened in the first draft of a paper or an article or a letter, and that the writer then had time to go back and revise, keeping that insight they achieved at the end as the guiding force that now drives the paper forward. On these papers, I inevitably end up writing something in the margins like, as a first draft, this is an A. As a final draft, more like a B-. You need to give yourself time to play with your argument, because often that is how you discover what it is that is really important about what you're trying to say. Now, even if you've moved past the initial writer's block, starting your article or short essay or a short story or letter can still be really difficult. If you find yourself just totally paralyzed because you're struggling to figure out where to start with your writing, my advice, and I've mentioned this before, my advice is always don't begin at the beginning. I had a good friend in graduate school, and she and I regularly exchanged pieces of our writing. Every week, usually on Thursdays, we'd give each other 10 pages or so, and then we met the next day on Friday afternoon to comment on and critique each other's work and have a talk about it. And without exception, the first 2 pages of everything my friend wrote were somewhat awkward, the language was clunky, it was kind of stilted. But then by page 3, it was as if a completely different person was writing. By page 3, her argument was humming along, her style had improved appreciably, and by the end, she usually had produced an excellent piece of writing that was articulate, witty, and original. And ultimately, that's the kind of writing we all want to produce. What she and I both learned from this experience is that sometimes you leave the first for last. Skip the introduction and get right to the meat of the argument. When you've made the claims that you want to make and you've summed up everything in a satisfying conclusion, then you can return and you can write an introduction that will probably be much smoother and more pleasing to read than the one that you struggled to write for so long, that you tore your hair out over. And you've done all this work, all this sweating, expended all this effort before you've even gotten to the meat of your argument. So it can really actually detract from your overall argument if you spend too much time on the introduction and it's just not coming. And by the way, finding a writing partner or a writing support group is a great way to get yourself motivated. If you know that you have a deadline when you actually have to hand something to someone else, who will in turn be passing something he or she has written to you for your comments, most people usually manage to get some words down on the page. Serving as a reader for someone else's work can also make you a better writer. As you edit a friend's writing or a colleague's writing, as you're looking for the thesis, as you're circling supporting points that really aren't fully or satisfactorily fleshed out or supported, you're also learning more about writing in a way that you can apply to your own work, and you can apply it almost immediately. As I've suggested several times before, if you want to improve your writing, read as much as you can. The more you read and write, the better you'll get at both. Now, for some people, getting to the meat of the argument is the most important thing. But for others, composing an effective piece of writing comes much more easily if you get the bones, if we want to call them that, the bones of the piece down first. Some people work better with an outline, even if it's just tentative and you've told yourself, okay, this may change. But some people, if they at least have an outline as a guide, it can help them as they move through their argument. Now, when I say outline, this could be anything from the sort of classic Roman numeral followed by capital letter type of outline that a lot of us learned how to create when we were in school. Or it could just simply be a quick jotting down of main point, supporting points, evidence, and conclusion. At the other end of the scattershot approach that works for me at the other end of the spectrum, there are those few people who move clearly and logically straight through whatever the writing piece is with no need for substantial tweaking and editing. My roommate my freshman year of college was this way. And this was back in the days before computers were common, and occasionally I would type up her handwritten papers for her as she didn't type and I did. Her papers were clearly structured, they were methodically organized, they moved logically from point to point, and her writing never showed signs of difficulty or struggle. And I was insanely jealous of this fact every time I typed her papers up because it felt like I had to work a whole lot harder to produce something. Now, my husband, who's also a college professor, he writes this way as well. He spends what feels like, to me, like a really long time working on, say, just an introductory paragraph or the discussion of a key quote that supports a claim he's trying to make. At the end of an hour of work, he may have produced one paragraph while I've generated 4 pages with my scattershot approach. But his careful attentiveness and his precision means that he almost never has to go back and do any substantial editing or rewriting, while my approach means that I always do. When he reaches the end of a paragraph, of an article or a chapter, he's pretty much finished, except for maybe some very minor revising. Now, when I reach the concluding point of what I want to say, when I reach that final paragraph, it means that the serious work of editing and restructuring is still before me. He and I simply work differently, although we both manage to be quite productive. And here again, it's just a matter of figuring out what kind of writing temperament you have, and then using an approach that works best for you. Okay, but what to do if you're just totally blocked and you can't figure out how to move forward? Well, this may sound like contradictory advice, but I've found that it works. Get away from the computer or the desk and do something physical. Studies have found that physical activity doesn't just help your body, it helps your brain. So in the middle of a paper or a short story, when you're stuck on a particular point, get out of the house and go for a walk or a run. Or put your notebook in your pocket and go for a short walk. And I bet you 15 minutes in, an idea will come to you that has something to do with your project. And you'll have your notebook right there so you can be ready to jot it down. The husband and wife writers Michael Chabon and Ayelet Waldman talk about how when they're stuck with their own writing, they go on what they like to call plot walks together. And the late science fiction writer Isaac Asimov said that whenever he was totally stuck, he'd go to the movies. He said it had to be a movie that would engage his consciousness without asking his subconscious to do too much work. In other words, something like an action movie or a romantic comedy. A bleak documentary or a foreign film with subtitles was not going to work for him. He said that without fail, this strategy allowed his subconscious to do some work on the problem he was encountering in his writing, and that when he left the theater, 9 times out of 10, he'd hit on a way to move forward. Now, obviously, the danger here is that you could spend a lot of time going to movies, and then you could claim that you're working. But if you use this strategy judiciously, it really can help. I hope that you found some of my strategies for overcoming writer's block helpful, and I hope you don't think I'm completely neurotic, although I wouldn't blame you. I mean, seriously, counting your minutes does sound a little extreme. But as I said, once I started doing this and it became a kind of game, my dissertation moved very quickly to completion. Your task is to find out what makes writing possible for you. Now that we've discussed how to get an early draft down on paper, we're going to turn our attention in our next lecture to editing that draft and making it as strong and persuasive and compelling as it can be.